Today, I'd like to talk about police, public, and the controversy going on with protests over the incident in Minneapolis, where a black citizen was essentially murdered by Minneapolis policemen. This has been going on for years and years and years, and it has got some publicity and a lot of protesting, but things don't seem to change. And the reason they don't change is a lot of people don't really look at this problem in perspective. They think it's a matter of racial prejudice or discrimination. They think it's a police matter or training of police matter or all kinds of simplistic things coming out of the newly trained dichotomous mind that seems to have been produced by the last few decades of education. It's a lot more than that. It's structural. And the structure has been changing ever since the Nixon administration. When I first started practicing law, law was considered to be a calling. My ancestors felt it was a calling. And there's several generations of both barristers and solicitors from England that have handed down ethics, views, thoughts, traditions throughout the generations, which now I try to respect and reflect. I've been an activist ever since I went to law school. I went to law school not to make a lot of money, but to be an instrument of change, to stand for certain things that I believed in. I was a product of what Lyndon Johnson later dubbed as the Great Society. Actually, I was a product of the Cold War. I grew up with atomic bomb drills, duck and cover, fire drills, and nerve gas drills because there was a nerve gas plant within a 45-minute drive of where I grew up. There were also missile silos about 7 miles away from where I lived. There was all kinds of targets up and down the Front Range where I lived. And the military-industrial complex was really, really active in the area in which I grew up. Most of the neighbors and the people I knew were either state or federal civil servants. They were government employees. They were good people. Most of them fairly altruistic. So when I went to undergraduate school, I went there with the purpose of either being a corrections officer or a social worker. It wasn't until after I was married and my wife said I could do more good going to law school and working that way as I could as a social worker that I decided to go to law school. And I went to law school mainly for training to be a social activist, which I have viewed myself as ever since. I was active in the civil rights movement. I was active in the anti-war movement. I was active in the free speech movement that Mario Savio had out of California. But mainly, I viewed myself as a crusader for justice. I was also trained as a sociologist. One of my specialty areas was criminology. did undergraduate courses and graduate courses in that. Later, I did graduate courses for certification in conflict management and went through the conflicts curriculum. I was taught how to train conflict specialists. After extensive study on that, I decided the whole approach wasn't really cost effective under a capitalistic system, so sort of lost interest. From there, I spent years studying postmodern social theory, where I think I found my niche. In any event, I started out as a structural functionalist, and was a ardent student of Max Weber. So I tend to look at things in terms of large-scale organization. When I helped establish the Free School for several years, I taught a course called Sociology of Law, and had done a lot of research in that. Later, I tried to guide some graduate students along that area, and the topics on dissertation committees on which I served were on domestic violence, street prostitution, drug policy, and the perception of the concept biker, or the social construction of reality, as the modern people would call it. I gave many hours of lectures to law students, practicing lawyers. I limited the class to those with over 10 years experience, and I called that class Surviving a Criminal Law Practice in a Postmodern Society. Now, I was also active in a lot of different causes and represented a lot of different causes. I had clients from the American Indian movement, from Corky Gonzalez's Crusade for Freedom, from the Black Panthers, from various unions, various civil rights activities. I represented some members of SDS, Vietnam veterans against the war. I tried to obtain an injunction against an Air Force base for trying to censor free speech of an Air Force Base newspaper. And lastly, I was approached by some people to represent a group called the Italian American Civil Rights Group, which kind of coordinated a lot of these activities and gave me a different perspective on how to look at them. So now I want to talk about what went on in Minneapolis. What went on in Minneapolis wasn't so much different than what I've seen going on in various cities throughout a half century of the law practice. I've always seen abuse. I've seen abuse by the police. There's several factors that I've analyzed and talked about, which I won't go into because I don't plan to teach a graduate course in conflict sociology regarding the police. Needless to say, we have to look at things as a social system and not as a social problem. What makes the police able to function the way they do? We have to look at how they're recruited, how they're trained, and how their behavior is reinforced. And we can't look at that without looking at the whole system, including that of prosecutors and judges. Because these enablers allow the police to commit murder and allow the practice to continue, because their perception of things is all screwed up. And ever since the Nixon administration, we've gone to war against various things, like the war on crime, the war on drugs, and also named the war on black people. And they want to call it the war on black people, and the press calls it the war on black people. But I disagree with that. It's a class war. It's a war against poor people. Poor people embarrass the rich. Poor people tend to make high-paid executives making millions a year embarrassed. They also don't like the poor people visible to others because it makes them think. It makes them more conscious of social privilege. Now, they like to translate that into white privilege, which is absolute bullshit. That's probably systemic rather than a conscious thing. But it's also a defection by the power elite and the powerful to pit races against each other instead of classes against each other. So, using the old Caesarian Roman technique, they divide and conquer. Well, I think for a while that's not going to work. After a while, that's not going to work. I think people are wising up. So let's take a look at the various parts. Back in the 60s, there was a sociological study done of what they called justice systems throughout the United States. And the researchers there divided the systems into 3 parts. One was a part that he called the judge system. Another one was called the prosecutor system. And the third one, unique to places like Denver, was called the police system. And he analyzed that in who had the power to make decisions and whose decisions were most recognized and followed. So in a prosecutor system, the DA has the power. The DA can make decisions, who to get charged, who to grant immunity to, and various things like that. How vigorously is someone prosecuted, or how slightly somebody is prosecuted. All of these decisions rest in whoever has the power. And in the prosecutor system, the prosecutor has the power. In the prosecutor system, most courts rubber stamp the prosecutor's decision. So, for instance, in Chicago, you have and have had for decades what is commonly thought of as a corrupt police system. Well, it's not exactly a corrupt police system as such, but there are certain things, certain practices, certain folk ways and mores of the police acting together as a police community, or you can compare it to a college fraternity, that get away with the boys will be boys attitude, and the attitude is rewarded by the prosecutor's office, or in Illinois, the state's attorney, and also rubber stamped by the judiciary. So as long as the peace is kept and the machine can stay well greased with contributions, the thing exists. And it's subtle, but it's inbred into the system. For instance, if you went to the clerk's office to look at a file as a lawyer, typically you'd put $1 or $2 underneath your file or legal pad. The clerk would take it and find the file. If he couldn't see the $1 or so, or didn't locate the $1 or so, he would look at you and say, I can't find it, without even bothering to look. And this was accepted behavior. It was accepted because it was efficient. Lawyers didn't want to stand in line for an hour or two when they were charging their clients by the hour. The court clerks realized this and figured, well, they can get ahead of the queue if you give us a little token, a little symbol of the fact that you appreciate us taking you out of line. So it goes from there. Pretty soon it goes into parking tickets and the like. Well, what causes this? Part of it is revenue. We are indoctrinated in this country to the premise that taxes are bad, taxes aren't good. And we're conditioned that even though we get what we pay for, we don't really expect much, and we would rather save a buck than have justice or a fair system. Well, who pays the bucks? It's not the poor people, at least not directly. Machine contributions are given by the people with money. After the people that give money are in power, they reimburse the system somewhat by exploiting the poor. This is done through various police actions. So the police then become sort of an occupying force, imposing various penalties on the poor for being poor and making the system run and making it run more efficiently and less costly to the power elite. The other system is the judge system, which used to be typical of the federal court, although with Attorney General Barr in there, I'm starting to think that maybe that is under challenge. We'll see on that. But typically in the old judge system, the judge set policy. He ran the courtroom, and if they didn't like some of the policies that the prosecutor was using to file cases or disposing of cases, the judge would object, and his objection would generally carry some weight. The third system, it was unique at that time to Denver, was called the police system, where the police made the decisions. So typical in a Denver situation is that an officer would write a ticket. The accepted behavior of the bar, prosecutors, and judges was they would reduce points on the ticket. Because you collect so many points, you get your driver's license revoked. And more drivers were concerned about the points assessed by a ticket than by the fines or whatever. So it sort of became standard procedure to reduce the charges once they appear in court. However, the prosecutors would always say they needed to get the officer's consent. Well, the end product of that is if the officer were a prick or didn't like a certain person, that person wouldn't get the so-called standard deal. So you couldn't really make a decision that was binding until you got the okay or approval or nod from the police officer. So they're the ones that had the power. In that then grew a police culture. And this went clear back to the days of the Ku Klux Klan when they were infiltrating the police structure and political structure of Denver. And the Klan was very law and orderish, and they were oppressive in their nature, particularly toward minorities, and especially toward black people. So that was the historical basis of the system rising out of Denver, which is starting to grow nationwide. So we have to look at the institution and how the whole system is structured. So it's not going to do any good to discipline the police if you don't look at the other structure. For instance, Colorado. A lot of this is run by money and money policy, and the fact that most taxpayers are cheap and don't understand government. They want efficiency because they're told that efficiency should reign supreme, kind of like the movie Cheaper by the Dozen, I guess. But efficiency and democracy are mutually exclusive terms. Look at the administration of a corporation, for instance, a public corporation. Minority shareholders can run the corporation as long as there isn't any organized movement against them. So if you run a public company, you can control by controlling the law firm representing the company, the accounting firm, and the public relations firm. Anybody who wants to oppose you, you can set up legal loopholes, public relations loopholes, etc. So if you're in power, you get to use the corporation's money to stay in power. But if you're a minority group within the corporation, you have to fund your own lawsuit or action against the corporate managers. So it's a rigged system. That is what is going on with our government. Our government is to the position where those paying the most get to rule, or what the conservatives call the golden rule. He who has the gold rules. So you've got a whole lobbying effort saying government's got to be efficient. Government's got to be run by business or like business. And people are buying that because basically they're not educated and sophisticated enough to understand the difference between a business and a government. So we get efficiency. And what happens with efficiency? You lose the concept of justice. So I remember many years ago, right when I first started practicing law, the judges wanted a raise. And politically, they couldn't get a raise. So the governor and judges, and Supreme Court judges particularly, came up with this idea. And that was the public wanted to see judges in the courtroom more. That's their concept of a judge. Rather than sitting, studying cases and thinking about things, he should go and set up an assembly line form of justice, meting out cases and ruling on cases in a production line sense. And the public would see that and say, oh, our government and judges are very efficient. They deserve the raise because they're working hard. Well, they're processing cases, they're not judging. So the next thing happens is you get some efficiency amendments and legislation. And one of the things that is really, really weighing upon the conservative element is the cost of pension plans and things like this, what they like to label as entitlements, even though the people that are blessed with these entitlements have it taken out of their pay over a number of years. It doesn't matter to them, they're entitlements. So, one of the big expenses in the state government is pension salaries. Now, judges make fairly decent money. And when they retire, they get a percentage of their high salaries. And to get a percentage is based on the year of services, or the years of service. So take a judge that is appointed when he's in his 50s. He might retire at 65 and have only 10 years of service. His retirement would be much less than somebody that started out in government right out of law school or in his 30s, who could put in 30 or 35 years. So it was harder to get judges that were older that couldn't build their retirements up. So they started making an unwritten rule or policy that to be a judge, you had to have been in government service for a few years, because then it would mount up and add to your pension fund. And since you're already in government service, it really wouldn't cost anymore whether you're a judge or administrator. So what you start seeing is that the majority of the judges came from prosecutor's office because they knew about processing cases, or other governmental agencies, but most of them had government experience. Well, the problem with that is when they're from a prosecutor's office, unlike they had before the Nixon administration, all the prosecutors are specialists trained in that and are professional prosecutors. And what the practical effect of that is they just stick a robe on these professional prosecutors, and the prosecutors become judges. And like the prosecutor's office and the judiciary, they rubber stamp the decisions that are made by policies set by district attorneys. So they are focused on prosecuting cases. They're focused on their numbers. One of my law partners once was a U.S. attorney, and we were talking about prosecuting. And one of the comments that came up is, why are there so few racketeering cases? And he said, well, when I was prosecuting, I could prosecute 5 Dyer Act stolen vehicles, or Mann Act violation, interstate transportation for sex, a week, and it would take me months to prosecute a racketeering case or an antitrust case or something like that. We're judged by the numbers we produce. So why spend all that time producing this case when I can produce 10 or 20 other cases and make my numbers good? That makes sense because, again, we're measuring by production under a production model rather than a justice model. So these young bureaucrats learn that way, and then they go into the judiciary and think that case management is what judging is all about, the same way as in the district attorney's office. So they try to shove through as many cases as they can, and they have what they call criminal justice specialists, which have nothing to do with specialists, but what they do is research how you can cram more cases through the meat grinder than you could before. So what's the best way to get up numbers? Drug cases. And you also want to not have the burden of some pretentious lawyer or some asshole lawyer going in there, interrupting the assembly line, throwing monkey wrenches. So you try to make the system smooth. Well, the people that benefit, or at least aren't affected that much, don't really care and don't pay attention. The people that are victimized are the poor people, and they don't have the power to complain. So year after year after year, this goes on, and the pressure mounts. When you have more people murdered by police than you had casualties in Vietnam, and you don't see much opposition, the poor people can't hire propagandists and public relations people like the police department can, or attorney generals, or prosecutors' offices. The press doesn't have time or money to do detailed investigations generally, and journalism pretty much has been relegated to journalists rewriting press releases sent out by the prosecutor element. So nobody's speaking for the poor, nobody's speaking for the disenfranchised, and because nobody speaks for them, the general public figures, well, they're not complaining and everything is okay, and it doesn't affect me, so why should I change? Well, that can only go on so long, and ignorance can only rule so long. And the public now is waking up. So next time we'll talk about how the public wakes up and how we can help it.